There is something I have never said out loud, not to my daughters, not to the preacher, not to the good women who sat beside me in church for 50 years and thought they knew the shape of my life. I have carried it the way you carry a stone in your shoe, every single step, every single day, until the walking itself became the pain and you can no longer remember what it felt like to move without it. I am old now, old in a way that makes the word itself seem too small. My hands have gone thin and the skin on them has that papery look, like something that was once meant to hold more than it does now. I do not always know what day it is, and I have made my peace with that. But I know exactly what happened on that afternoon in the summer of 1859. I know it the way you know the sound of your own name. I know it better than I know the faces of my grandchildren, better than I know the prayers I have repeated 10,000 times. That afternoon is the one thing in me that has never faded, never softened, never agreed to become something easier to live with. I want you to understand something before I begin. I'm not telling you this because I want your sympathy. Sympathy is a young person's currency, and I have spent too long in this world to need it. I am telling you this because I am the last one who was there. My husband has been gone for 31 years. My oldest daughter passed in the winter of 1903. There is no one left who remembers that day the way I remember it, from the inside, from the place where it happened, from the exact angle of the sun and the exact sound of the water. When I go, this goes with me, and I have decided that is not right. Some things are too heavy to be buried quietly. My name is Eleanor. I was born in the spring of 1838 on a small farm in western Pennsylvania, not far from a town so modest it barely deserved the name. My father was a man who worked hard and spoke little, which I took for wisdom when I was young and understood much later was simply exhaustion. My mother was a woman of considerable faith and very little sentiment, which sounds cold when I say it plainly like that, but was not cold at the time. It was simply the weather of our household, the climate we all lived in and adapted to without question. I was the second of 4 children. My brother Thomas was 3 years older than me and seemed to belong to a different species entirely. He was loud, confident, entirely at ease in his body, which I admired and could not understand. My younger sisters, Clara and Ida, came after me in quick succession and spent most of their childhood attached to each other in the way that younger sisters sometimes are, a closed and private world that I watched from the outside with more curiosity than longing. We were not wealthy. I want to be precise about that because wealthy is a word that covers too much ground. We were not hungry. We had a house with 4 walls and a roof that held, a garden that produced what we needed in good years and something close to enough in bad ones. My father kept several cows and a small number of pigs, and the rhythms of those animals organized our days entirely. You rose when they needed you, and you worked until they were settled. And then you did the 100 other things that keeping a household required. And then you slept, and then you rose again. I learned to read from my mother, who considered it a moral necessity rather than a luxury. She taught me from the Bible and from 2 other books she owned. One a collection of essays by a man whose name I cannot now recover. The other, a thin volume of poetry that I read so many times, the cover separated from the pages and had to be pressed back with glue made from flour and water. I did not know, when I was reading those poems by the light of a tallow candle on winter evenings, that I was building something inside myself, some room where language could live, some place I would return to again and again when the outer world became unbearable. School was 3 miles distant, and we attended when the season allowed, which meant not during planting and not during harvest, and not when the mud made the road impassable, which in Pennsylvania happened with a regularity that would surprise you. I was a serious student in the way that girls who feel slightly out of place everywhere tend to be serious students. School was a place where the rules were clear and the rewards were straightforward, and I understood exactly what was wanted from me. By the time I was 16, I could keep accounts, write a clean letter, and recite passages of Scripture with enough fluency that the preacher once complimented my mother in a way that made her quietly proud, though she would not have shown it. By the time I was 19, I'd been introduced to a young man named George Calloway, who had come from Ohio to work on a neighboring farm, and within a year of meeting him, I had agreed to become his wife. That is how quickly life moved then. There was not much room for extended deliberation. You looked at a man, you assessed what you could see, you made your choice, and then you lived inside that choice for the rest of your days. I did not find this frightening at the time. I find it extraordinary now, looking back, the confidence of it, the sheer forward momentum of a young woman who did not yet know what waiting at the bottom of all that confidence. George Calloway was not a complicated man, and I mean that without cruelty. There are people in this world who are built from contradictions, who carry whole arguments inside themselves, who cannot cross a room without reconsidering their direction 3 times. George was not that. He knew what he wanted, he knew what he believed, and he moved through life with the steady, unhurried certainty of a draft horse that has learned its route so well it no longer needs to think about the turns. In the beginning, I found this enormously comforting. After a childhood spent trying to read my father's silences and interpret my mother's restraint, there was something deeply restful about a man who simply said what he meant. We married in April of 1858 in the small white church outside of Hadley, where I had been baptized as an infant and confirmed at 13. The ceremony was modest, a dress my mother and I made together from fabric she had been saving, a handful of neighbors, a dinner afterward at my parents' table that lasted until the candles burned low. George's family was in Ohio and could not make the journey, which saddened him in the quiet way he experienced most things, a brief shadow crossing his face, and then gone. I wore flowers in my hair that my sister Clara had gathered that morning, and I remember thinking, standing at the front of that small church with the spring light coming through the windows at a low angle, that my life was beginning in the most literal possible sense, that everything before this moment had been preparation and everything after would be the actual living. We settled on a piece of land about 4 miles from my parents, which George had been working toward for 2 years before we met, saving carefully, negotiating patiently, making arrangements with a deliberateness that I came to understand was simply the way he approached every problem worth solving. The farmhouse was small and needed considerable work, but the land was good. George could look at soil the way some men look at a face, reading it, understanding its qualities and its limits, knowing what it would give and what it would refuse. That first spring he planted what the land told him to plant, and by summer I understood that I had married someone who knew his work with a depth that commanded respect even from me, who had grown up around farming and thought I already knew everything about it. Our first year was hard in the particular way that first years are hard, not catastrophic, but unrelenting. There was always something that needed doing and never quite enough hours to do it. I cooked and kept the house and helped where I could in the fields during the heavy seasons, and George worked from before dawn until the light failed completely, and we fell into bed each night with the specific exhaustion of people who have spent everything they had and know they will need to find the same amount again tomorrow. But there was satisfaction in it too, a clean kind of tiredness that felt earned. We were building something, and we could feel it taking shape beneath our hands. Our first child, a daughter we named Ruth, was born in February of 1859. She arrived in the deep of winter, during a cold spell that had frozen the water in the wash basin overnight, and the neighbor woman who came to help said afterward that Ruth had announced herself to the world with more determination than most, which turned out to be an accurate description of her character for the next 80 years. Ruth was healthy and loud and certain of her needs in a way that exhausted and delighted me in equal measure. 14 months after Ruth came William, who was quieter, more watchful, a baby who seemed to be studying everything around him, with an attention that sometimes made you feel you were being evaluated. Then, in the spring of 1863, came our third child, a boy we named Samuel. And Samuel, I have to stop here a moment because even now, even after all these decades, the name does something to the air around me when I say it. Samuel was the one who was different. Not different in any way that anyone outside our family would have noticed, but different to me from the first week of his life, in a way I could not have explained then and can barely explain now. He was a gentle child. That is the truest word I have for him. Ruth was strong-willed, William was observant, but Samuel was gentle in the way that certain animals are gentle, not weak, not timid, but fundamentally soft in his approach to the world, as though he had arrived already knowing that things could break and had decided to be careful. He had George's brown eyes, but something in his expression that was entirely his own, a kind of open readiness, as if he was always expecting that whatever came next would be worth seeing. By the time Samuel was walking, I had already developed the particular awareness that mothers sometimes develop for one child over the others. Not more love, I want to be clear about that. Not more love, but a different quality of attention, a watchfulness that I could not entirely account for. I noticed where he was in a room. I noticed when he was quiet. I noticed the small changes in his face before I noticed them in my other children. And I told myself this was simply because he was the youngest, because that is what mothers tell themselves. I did not yet know what that watchfulness was trying to tell me. The summer of 1866 was the kind of summer that makes you believe, for a few weeks at least, that the world has decided to be generous. The hay came in thick and clean, the kitchen garden produced more than we could use, and there was a quality to the evenings that I can only describe as abundance, the light staying long and golden, the air warm without being punishing, the children playing in the yard until the fireflies came out, and I called them in from the back step with a voice that carried easily across the still air. Samuel was 3 years old that summer. 3 years old and already the kind of child who made strangers stop and look twice, not because of any particular beauty, though he was a handsome boy, but because of that quality I mentioned, that openness, that readiness, as though the world was a gift he was perpetually in the process of unwrapping. Ruth was 7 by then and had taken on the role of eldest with a seriousness that sometimes made George and me exchange glances over her head. She organized the younger ones, corrected their behavior, appointed herself the keeper of rules she invented with considerable authority. William, who was 5, had developed a deep attachment to the animals. He spent hours in the barn with the patient concentration of someone twice his age, and George said more than once that the boy understood horses in a way that couldn't be taught. And then there was Samuel, trailing after both of them, absorbing everything, laughing easily, loving without reservation, the way very young children love before the world teaches them to be careful about it. George was good with them. I want to say that clearly because I did not say it enough when it mattered. He was not a demonstrative father. He did not make long speeches or offer elaborate praise. But he was present in the way that counts, the way that children actually register. He came in from the fields and lifted them each in turn. He remembered what they told him and asked about it the next day. He repaired Samuel's wooden toy horse 3 separate times without complaint, each time with the same steady patience, as though the horse's repeated breakage was simply part of his responsibilities, and he had no objection to it. That summer, George had been working on expanding the lower field, which meant longer days and a tiredness that settled into him by evening, like something physical taking up residence. I was managing most of the household alone during those weeks, which was not unusual and not something I considered remarkable. It was simply the seasonal arithmetic of farm life, the way labor distributed and redistributed itself according to what the land required. I kept the children fed and washed and occupied. I put up preserves, I mended, I managed, and at night I fell asleep before George came in and woke before he rose, and that was the rhythm of those particular weeks. There was a creek that ran along the eastern edge of our property. I should tell you about it because you need to understand what it was. It was not a large body of water. In spring it ran fast and full with the snowmelt, but by July it had settled into something calm and shallow, perhaps knee-deep at its center, running clear over a bed of smooth, flat stones. The children knew it well. We had been to that creek dozens of times as a family, on Sunday afternoons when the work allowed, and I had waded in it myself to cool my feet on hot days and watch the children splash in the shallows while George sat on the bank and smoked his pipe with the particular contentment of a man who has earned his rest. I did not think of the creek as dangerous. That is the truth, and it is the truth I have turned over in my hands for 60 years, like a stone I keep expecting to find a different side of. It was familiar. Familiarity is its own kind of blindness. It smooths over the edges of things, convinces you that what you know cannot surprise you. That July, Ruth had begun helping me more deliberately in the house. She had asked to learn to bake bread, which I found touching and a little amusing, and on several mornings that month we worked side by side at the kitchen table, her small hands pressing into the dough with an earnestness that made me think of my own mother standing at that same kind of table a generation before. William had his routines with the animals, and Samuel had developed a habit that summer of following a particular path along the fence line toward the creek, stopping to examine whatever caught his interest, a beetle, a stone, a patch of different colored grass, with the methodical curiosity that was entirely his own nature. I knew he did this. I had watched him do it many times. I had followed him, walked beside him, shown him where to stop. He knew the boundary. He had been told it clearly, in the direct language that George and I used with all our children for important things. Not frightening language, but serious language, the kind that a child understands means this is not negotiable. The creek was for together times, not for alone. He was 3 years old and he knew the rule, and he had kept it every time. Until the afternoon he didn't, and I was inside. I was standing at the kitchen table with flour on my hands and Ruth beside me, and the bread was rising, and the afternoon was quiet, and I did not notice how quiet it was. I did not notice. For a stretch of time I have never been able to measure precisely, 10 minutes perhaps more, that I could not hear Samuel anywhere near the house. It was Ruth who said it, not with alarm. She was 7, and 7 does not yet know the specific weight certain words can carry. She simply looked up from the dough, the way children look up when a thought arrives, and said, "Where is Samuel?" And something moved through me in that instant that I have never found the right word for. Not quite fear, not yet. Something earlier than fear. A pulling sensation, low and sudden, like the ground shifting just slightly beneath your feet before you understand what kind of shift it is. I wiped my hands on my apron. I went to the back door and looked out at the yard. The yard was empty in the particular way that feels wrong, not peacefully empty, but abandoned empty, the kind of emptiness that has recently been something else. William was at the barn. I could hear him, the soft sound of his voice talking to the horses the way he always did. But the yard held nothing, and the path along the fence line held nothing, and the afternoon was very quiet in a way I had not registered until that exact moment. I called his name, once, then twice, with the second call already carrying something different in it, a sharpness, an edge of urgency that I had not decided to put there, but that came on its own. No answer came back. The field beyond the fence was still. The long grass at the edge of the property moved slightly in a small wind and then stopped. I was running before I had consciously decided to run. I remember the feeling of the ground under my feet, the uneven summer grass, the way one of my shoes caught slightly on a root near the fence post, and I stumbled and caught myself without slowing. I remember the sound of my own breathing, which had already changed into something I did not recognize as mine. I remember the sun, which was still high and bright and completely indifferent to everything that was happening beneath it. The creek came into view around the stand of birch trees that grew along the eastern boundary, and I saw the water first, the way it caught the light, running silver and calm over the stones, exactly as it always looked, exactly as it had looked every Sunday afternoon when we sat on the bank and I had thought of it as beautiful. And then I saw Samuel. I will not go further into what I saw. I want you to understand that I've made a deliberate choice about how much of this I am willing to put into words, not to protect myself. That protection stopped being available to me a long time ago. But because some things, when you describe them too precisely, stop being true and start being something else, a performance of pain rather than the pain itself. What I will tell you is this: the water was shallow. It was shallow enough that what happened should not have been possible, and yet it was possible, and it happened, and I was not there when it began. I reached him. I pulled him from the water. I carried him back to the bank, and I did everything a mother does in that moment. Everything that instinct and desperation and the refusal to accept what your eyes are telling you will drive you to do. I called for George. I heard my own voice carrying across the field with a quality it had never had before and would never entirely lose afterward, a sound built from somewhere below language, below thought, below everything that separates a person from the animal understanding of catastrophe. George came. The neighbor woman came. The doctor came from town 2 hours later, and by then there was nothing the doctor's arrival could change. Samuel was 3 years old and 4 months, and he was gone, and the afternoon continued its business around us with the terrible, ordinary persistence that the world maintains, even when you're standing in the complete ruin of everything you thought was permanent. The doctor said it had been very fast. He said this, I understood later, to give us something to hold on to, a kindness shaped like information. George stood beside me, and I could feel the particular quality of his stillness, not the stillness of acceptance, but the stillness of a man who has not yet found the place inside himself where this new reality can be put. Ruth had been brought to the neighbor's house. William did not fully understand what had happened, but he understood that something had broken, and he stood in the doorway of the house with his hands at his sides and a look on his face that was far too old for him. I remember the light changing as the evening came on. I remember thinking, with a strange, clear portion of my mind that seemed to be operating at some distance from the rest of me, that I needed to bring in the bread that Ruth and I had left rising on the kitchen table. It seemed important in the way that small, practical things become important when the larger world has stopped making sense. A fixed point, a task with a clear completion, something I could still do correctly. I went inside. I took the bread from the table. I don't know what I did with it. I stood in the kitchen for a long time in the fading light, and Ruth was not there, and William was not there, and from somewhere outside I could hear George's voice, low and steady, talking to someone, and the house around me felt like a place I had never been before, like a place I had only heard described, and had now arrived in and found it nothing like the description. Samuel's wooden horse was on the floor near the door. One of its legs had come loose again. The days that followed had a texture I had never encountered before and have never found again. Not the texture of grief as I had understood it until then. My grandmother had died when I was 11 and an infant cousin before that, and those losses had taught me a version of sorrow that moved in a recognizable direction, that had a beginning and a middle, and eventually, painfully, something resembling an end. This was different. This had no direction at all. It was simply a condition, like weather that has settled in and forgotten to move on, and you wake each morning inside it and go to sleep inside it, and at no point during the day does it lift enough to show you what used to be underneath. George did not speak about Samuel for 11 days after we buried him. I counted. I was counting everything in those weeks, the days, the meals, the times I managed to eat something, the times I heard William laugh and then stop himself as though laughter had become something requiring permission. George worked. He went to the fields earlier than usual and came back later, and I understood that the fields were the only place he knew how to be, the only place where his body understood what was wanted from it. I did not blame him for this. I want to say that clearly. I did not blame George for the way he carried it, because his way of carrying it was the only way he had. What I could not navigate was the silence between us. We had always been a household of moderate words. Neither of us was given to long conversation, and we had built a companionship that relied more on presence than on speech. But the silence after Samuel was a different kind of silence entirely. It had substance. It had weight. It sat at the table with us at meals and stood between us in the evenings and lay in the bed alongside us at night, and neither of us knew how to address it without risking something we were both, I think, afraid to crack open. On the 11th day, George came in from the fields at midday, which he never did. He sat down at the kitchen table without taking off his hat, which was also something he never did, and he said very quietly that he could not understand how it had happened, not as an accusation. I want to be precise about that because I have revisited that moment so many times that I am careful now about what I assign to it. He was not accusing me. He was expressing the particular bewilderment of a man who organizes his world around the principle that attention and effort produce safety, and who had encountered the place where that principle breaks down entirely. But I heard it as an accusation, or perhaps I did not hear it as one. Perhaps what happened was that the accusation I had already been leveling at myself found his words and attached itself to them, used them as a vessel. I said nothing. He did not say anything further. He went back to the fields, and that conversation, such as it was, became the closest we ever came to speaking directly about what I knew and what he perhaps suspected and what neither of us could afford in those raw early weeks to lay out plainly between us. The neighbor women came, as they do. They brought food, and they sat with me, and they said the things that people say, the things that are meant kindly and land with a softness that cannot quite reach where the pain actually lives. One of them told me it was God's will, which I received without argument because she meant it as comfort, and I had not yet developed the particular hard clarity about that phrase that came later. Another told me that Samuel was in a better place, and I looked at her face while she said it, her honest, believing face, and thought about the creek and the flat stones in the afternoon light, and wondered what geometry of the universe could make that sentence true. Ruth became very quiet. This alarmed me more than crying would have, because Ruth's natural state was a kind of energetic authority, and when that went out of her, it left something unfamiliar behind. She helped me without being asked. She moved around the house carefully, picking things up and putting them down with a gentleness she had not previously applied to objects, as though she had learned suddenly that things could be lost and was now recalibrating her relationship with everything around her. I watched her doing this and felt a grief layered on top of grief. The grief of watching your living child learn the weight of mortality at 7 years old. William asked me, about 3 weeks after, whether Samuel had been frightened. He asked it very directly, standing in the kitchen doorway in the early morning, and the question hit me somewhere so specific and so undefended that I had to turn away for a moment before I could answer. I told him no. I do not know if that was true. I said it because it was the only answer a mother can give a 5-year-old boy who is trying to find a place to put his fear. And I have told myself since that the telling of it was an act of mercy rather than dishonesty. But it added itself to the accumulation, that small, necessary lie, one more thing I was carrying that I had not chosen to set down. George and I did not find our way back to each other easily. We found a functional proximity. We managed the farm. We cared for Ruth and William. We maintained the surface of a household. But something had shifted in the architecture between us. Some load-bearing element had changed, and we both moved around it without naming it. The way you learn to navigate a room that has furniture you cannot move. The silence had become our language, and inside that silence I had already begun to build my case against myself. Guilt, I have learned, does not arrive all at once. That is the thing about it that nobody warns you about, perhaps because the people who know it most intimately are too deep inside it to describe its mechanics clearly. It does not come as a single blow that you absorb and then recover from. It comes the way water comes into an old house. First a small darkness in one corner, a softness in the wood that you notice and tell yourself is nothing, and then a little more, and then a little more, and one day you realize the whole floor has given way beneath you, and you cannot remember when it began, because it began so gradually and so quietly that you accommodated each stage before you recognized what you were accommodating. The case I built against myself was detailed and thorough. I was a precise woman, and I applied that precision to my own prosecution with a dedication I never applied to anything else in my life. The arguments were not dramatic. They were small and specific, and all the more devastating for their smallness. I had been inside. I had been at the kitchen table. I had been 10 minutes, perhaps more, without checking where Samuel was, and he was 3 years old, and the creek was within reach, and I had known both of those facts simultaneously, and had still allowed myself to be occupied with bread. The bread. It comes back to that, always. The bread that I cannot now remember what I did with. The bread that was rising on the table while my son was walking the path I knew he walked, toward the boundary I had told him not to cross. I told myself, in those first months, that it was a single lapse, a single failure of attention in 1,000 days of good attention. But that argument, which should have provided some relief, provided none at all, because Samuel did not need 1,000 days. He needed that one afternoon, that one interval of attention, and I had given it to bread. I did not say any of this to George. Our language had settled by then into the practical and the necessary, the farm, the children, the weather, the work. He was not an unkind man, and I don't believe he held me responsible in the way I held myself responsible. But there was a question he had asked on that 11th day. I could not understand how it happened, and I had never answered it, and the unanswered question sat between us like an object we had both agreed to walk around. Sometimes I thought about answering it. I would rehearse it in my mind during the long afternoons, the words I might use, the order I would put them in, the way I would explain that I had been inside and had not heard, and had not gone to check, and had not, for 10 minutes or perhaps more, known where my 3-year-old son was. I never said it. Every time I came to the edge of saying it, something stopped me. I told myself it was protection, protecting George from a version of events that would only add to his pain without changing anything that had happened. But I understood even then, in some honest portion of myself, that the protection was not primarily for George. The protection was for me, not from his anger, which I did not think would come, from his forgiveness. That was what I could not bear, the possibility that he would hear what I had done and forgive me for it, because forgiveness from George would have required me to accept that forgiveness was available, and I had already decided, at some level I had not consciously chosen, that it was not. So I kept it. I folded it into the interior, and I lived around it, the way you live around a room in your house that you have sealed and stopped entering. The room was always there. The house was organized around it. Every decision I made about myself for the next decade, and the decade after that, and the decade after that, was made in relation to that sealed room, whether I was aware of it or not. I became a harder mother to Ruth and William. Not cruel, I want to be clear about that, but harder, more watchful, more exacting in ways that I could feel were excessive, even as I applied them. I knew where they were at every moment. I called them in from play earlier than other mothers called their children. I checked and rechecked in a way that Ruth, who was old enough to notice, found suffocating, though she would not have used that word until much later, when she was grown and said it to me directly in a conversation I had not expected and could not adequately respond to. I could not explain to Ruth that what she was experiencing was not distrust of her, but the permanent aftermath of the one time I had trusted the afternoon to manage itself, and discovered that it would not. I could not explain that my vigilance was not about her, that it was about me, about the proof I was constantly seeking that I was not the woman who had stood at a kitchen table while her son walked toward the creek, that I could be, given enough watchfulness and enough years and enough demonstrated care, some other version of myself, a version that deserved to be a mother. I never found her, that other version. I looked for 60 years and she was not there. What was there instead was me, the actual me, the one who had been inside, the one with flour on her hands. And eventually, much later than it should have happened, I began to understand that those two women I was trying to separate were the same woman all along. But that understanding was a long way off yet. In those years after Samuel, I was still deep in the building phase, still laying the foundations of the case, still adding evidence, still serving as my own judge and my own prosecutor and my own prison, all at once. The years move the way years move when you're not watching them with any particular hope, steadily, without ceremony, accumulating into decades before you have finished accounting for the one before. Ruth grew up and married a man from 2 counties east, a schoolteacher named Harold, who had kind eyes and a measured way of speaking that reminded me, in certain lights, of George at his best. She gave me 3 grandchildren by the time she was 30, and I loved those children with something that was partly genuine joy and partly a vigilance so deeply habituated by then that I could no longer distinguish where one ended and the other began. William became a farmer like his father, settled on land not 4 miles from ours, and visited regularly with a reliability that I recognized as love, even when he expressed it through the practical, fixing a fence post, bringing over a side of cured meat in November, sitting at the kitchen table and drinking coffee in the same comfortable silence that he had learned from George. George himself aged the way a strong men age when the work finally begins to cost more than it returns, gradually, then all at once. By his middle 50s, he had developed a stiffness in his hands that made the heavier work difficult, and we hired a neighbor's son to take on what George could no longer manage. He accepted this without complaint, which was entirely consistent with his character. But I watched something shift in him during those years, a quiet relinquishing, as though the farm had been the primary argument for his presence in the world, and he was not entirely sure what remained when it was reduced. We did not grow closer in his later years, not in the way I have heard some couples describe, a return to each other after the children leave, a rediscovery. We grew alongside each other instead, 2 people who had shared 40 years of the same ground and knew each other's habits with an intimacy that had replaced, somewhere along the way, the other kinds of intimacy. It was not unhappy. I want to say that truthfully. It was simply what it had become. George died in the January of 1891, in his sleep, which the doctor said was his heart, which I believed was exhaustion accumulated over a lifetime of giving everything he had to the land and keeping very little back for himself. I sat beside him that morning before the house woke up and held his hand, which was already cold, and said the things I had not said while he was living, in the way that people do, quietly, to someone who can no longer respond, which is perhaps the only condition under which some words can finally be released. I did not tell him about the 10 minutes. Even then, even in that room with no one to hear and nothing left to protect, I did not say it aloud. The habit of containment was too old by then. It had outlasted almost everything else. After George, I went to live with Ruth and Harold for a period of 2 years, which was generous of them and quietly difficult for all 3 of us in the way that these arrangements tend to be. Then William built a small addition onto his farmhouse, and I moved there into 2 rooms that were mine, with a window that looked east over the fields and caught the morning light in a way I found unexpectedly sustaining. I was in my mid-50s by then, which felt ancient to me at the time and seems remarkably young to me now from this distance. The grandchildren grew. The world changed in ways that arrived at my window, like weather from a direction I did not know how to read. The telegraph, the railroad pushing further into every county, the talk of electricity in the towns, the slow alteration of everything that had been fixed and permanent in my understanding of how life was organized. I was not hostile to these changes, simply bewildered by the speed of them, the way each decade seemed to require a complete renegotiation of what could be assumed. I'd been born into a world where a letter took 2 weeks, and a journey of 50 miles was a significant undertaking. I was watching my grandchildren grow up in a world where both of those facts were becoming obsolete, and I could not always find the thread connecting the world I had started in to the one I was ending in. But Samuel did not change. That is the particular property of the dead. They do not revise. Everyone and everything else moved and shifted and became something different from what it had been. But Samuel remained exactly 3 years and 4 months old, exactly as he was on the last afternoon. I saw him following the fence line with his particular methodical attention, stopping to examine something in the grass, utterly absorbed in the small investigation of the world. He remained the child who broke his wooden horse 3 times. He remained the child Ruth had asked after without alarm, the way you ask after something you expect to find. I kept his age in my mind the way you keep an important number, deliberately, precisely, refusing to let it blur. He would have been 20 in 1883, 30 in 1893, 46 the year I turned 70. I tracked it because it seemed the least I could do, to know how old he was in each year I continued to live through, to carry that parallel life alongside my own as a kind of accounting, a record of what the afternoon had taken. 50 years after that summer, I was 73 years old and Samuel would have been 53, and I was still building the case, still adding to it, still finding new evidence in small moments, a grandchild left unwatched for an instant, a lapse in attention, a moment of distraction that confirmed what I had decided about myself in the weeks after his death and had never once successfully argued against. The case had become my closest companion, closer than Ruth, closer than William, closer than George had ever been. It knew me completely, and I had stopped imagining life without it. I am 91 years old as I tell you this. My body has become something I manage rather than inhabit. It requires negotiation now, careful handling, the kind of daily attention you give to something fragile and irreplaceable that you know cannot last much longer. My vision has narrowed at the edges. My hearing catches some things and releases others without my permission. But my mind, in the mornings especially, still has its clear hours, and it is in those hours that I have decided to finally say what I have never said, to give this the only form of release that remains available to me. Ruth came to visit last spring. She's 73 now, which is extraordinary to me. I can still see her at 7, standing at the kitchen table with flour on her small hands, asking where Samuel was. She sat beside my bed and we talked for a long afternoon, the kind of talking that old age permits and younger years do not, where the usual management of what you reveal and what you withhold loosens its grip and things come out that have been waiting a long time for the right conditions. She told me she had thought about that afternoon for most of her life. She said she had spent years wondering whether she should have noticed sooner that Samuel was not in the yard, whether her question, asked so lightly, so without urgency, had come too late. I looked at her face when she said this, my daughter's face, 73 years old, still carrying something she had picked up at 7 and apparently never put down. And something broke open in me that had been sealed for so long I had forgotten what was behind it. I told her, for the first time to any living person, that she had nothing to carry, that she was 7 years old and she had done the only thing that mattered, which was to ask the question, that what came before the question and after the question was mine, entirely mine, and had never belonged to her for a single day of her life. She wept. I held her hand, this old woman who is my daughter, and I felt the particular grief of understanding how long she had been holding something that was never hers to hold, and how much of that was my fault, not the original fault, not the 10 minutes, but the decades of silence that had left her alone with a question she had no way to answer, because I had never given her the truth that would have released her from it. I told her everything, the bread, the table, the 10 minutes that I had counted and recounted for 60 years, the way I had stood in the kitchen afterward with flour still on my hands and not known what to do with myself, the case I had built and maintained and lived inside of for the better part of a century. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something I was not prepared for. She said that she had always known I was not at fault, not because she had been there and seen it, she had not, but because she had been a mother herself 3 times over, and she knew what motherhood actually looked like from the inside, knew the 1,000 daily negotiations between attention and necessity, knew that a child of 3 could move from safety to danger in an interval so brief that no amount of vigilance, however absolute, could guarantee against it. She said this to me with a directness and a certainty that I found, in that moment, both devastating and necessary. Devastating because I had spent 60 years constructing an argument and she had dismantled it in 4 sentences. Necessary because the dismantling was real, not consolation, not the comfortable softening of truth, but an actual counter-argument from someone who had earned the right to make it. I did not accept it immediately. 60 years of architecture does not come down in an afternoon. But something shifted. Some small structural element that had been load-bearing for so long I had forgotten it could move. It moved. And in the space that opened up, I found something I had not expected to find at this late stage. Not forgiveness exactly. I'm not sure I have the remaining time to fully reach forgiveness, and I have stopped pretending I know exactly what that word means when you apply it to yourself, but something adjacent to it, a recognition, finally arrived at, that what happened on that afternoon was a catastrophe, and that catastrophe is not the same thing as crime, that a mother standing at a kitchen table for 10 minutes is not the same thing as a mother who did not love her child, that Samuel knew he was loved, knew it in the way that children know things that have been demonstrated to them every day of their lives, and that this knowledge was real and mine and cannot be retroactively destroyed by the 10 minutes. I think about him still, every morning. He would have been 103 years old this spring. I cannot fully imagine that, a man of 103, but I try, because trying is the last form of presence I can offer him. I imagine the face he might have grown into, George's eyes and that openness that was entirely his own, deepened by decades, softened by age. I imagine him with children of his own, grandchildren, a life that accumulated and changed and surprised him. I give him all of it in my imagination because it is mine to give and I have been too long in withholding things. If you take anything from what I have told you today, take this. The weight you carry in silence does not stay yours alone. It distributes itself quietly and without your permission to everyone around you. Ruth carried a question for 66 years that I could have answered in 60 seconds. My silence did not protect her. It only kept her in the dark alongside me. Say the thing. Say it while there is still someone to hear it and still time for the hearing to matter. I waited until I was 91, and it was nearly too late, and nearly is a word that still frightens me more than I can say. Samuel. His name was Samuel. He was 3 years old, and he loved the world with everything he had. And he was loved, and that is the truest and most complete thing I know.